Hello, everyone. This is our presentation on disability and rights and analysis of disability, which we think should be included in compulsory schooling in order to promote social justice.
Thank you. So I'm just going to start on the first slide, which is the concepts of disability. So when we're discussing disability as a concept interacting in a social world of inclusion and exclusion of us and them, there's also kind of different ways that disability is viewed. So if we look at kind of how the state views disability as a whole, so if we look at kind of all the kind of UK legislations from 50, 20 years ago till now, there's nothing actually there for people who are disabled. They've just focused on the kind of mental aspect of it, but nothing else. It was only in 2010 that they introduced the Disability Act, which covers kind of discrimination, but it wasn't there before that. In 2011, there was a social movement called the Hardest Hit. So this was when the government decided that they were going to kind of stop the living allowances for people who are disabled, and just reduce them significantly to a point where it was just kind of like they were living on nothing. That already kind of shows you like they had to really fight for their rights. So the government as a whole didn't really kind of view people who are disabled the same. They made them work twice as hard. If you were to compare it to someone else, like for example, if I was on universal credit, there wouldn't be much of a, I just have to go through a few simple questions, that's it. But for people who are disabled, they are expected to kind of show why they are. So they would have to show proof that they are receiving kind of help from hospitals, from doctors, medical notes. And even then they would have to get assessed. So they introduced this new assessment called personal independent payment. So that's when they would have to get reassessed by the government. And this was like only like last year. So they would have to get reassessed by the government to decide whether they are disabled or not. Thank you for that. We're just going to start on to the next slide.
So moving on from looking at disability through the lens of the state, through their policies, Ellie Clare goes into dominant paradigms of disability and argues that although the causes of disability injustice lie outside of our bodies and society, it is the profound relationships disabled bodies have to that injustice that causes damaging stereotypes and their identities becoming storage sites for the very oppressions we want to eradicate. So using this, it means that we need to understand the different paradigms of disability in order to prevent those injustices being absorbed from disabled people. So the dominant models that she goes into is the medical model, where we see disability as a faulty machine needing mending. This suggests that disability is no more than physical symptoms, and fixing them would make them a normal person. And the next that she observes in society is the charity model of disability, where it's seen as a tragedy, and fixing a disabled person makes you morally good. And this kind of implies that disabled people have no agency and capability to help themselves. Next is her supercrip model, where disabled people are seen as superheroes for living with disability, and to overcome it, they can use enhancements and to exceed the ability of non-disabled people. Again, this is very damaging to disabled people and takes away from their experiences. Next is the moral model of disability, and to use a quote to explain this would be, the sins of the father would express itself in the disability of the child, meaning that, it's a moral failing that has meant that they are disabled as a smite from God. And this is also linked to methodologies of race, and we will talk about this in another slide more. So, to conclude from that, she suggests that we should see disability through the disability model, where we view disability with emphasis on the conditions of ableism, so the conditions of society that is formed around people who are able-bodied, and how that prevents people with disability from functioning to the best of their ability. And that's how we should see our society now. We should change what's in society to fit with disabled people, rather than trying to change disabled people or seeing them through different modes which legitimize our able-bodied society. So to go on from this, I'm going to talk about and Gilson, and they go into legitimacy theory, where they query the legitimacy of the atypical body for membership or exclusion from the category of human by sculpting the collective and individual meaning of bodies through the explicit and tacit process of acceptance or exclusion. So this kind of goes back to the first slide that we talked about, how, you know, different processes of policy and legitimization can act to either exclude or accept certain bodies. In this case, able-bodied and disabled bodies. So it kind of questions this theory, like, you know, what criteria are needed for the individual to receive approval as a bona fide, true, real human, and how that membership can exclude disabled bodies from the category of the bona fide human. So she goes into embodied disablement and humanness, intersecting through 4 forms of legitimacy. So the first is violating humanness. So this is kind of a hegemony of what should be standards which are set by historical forces and medical rhetoric. Some of those historical forces may be from colonialization or slavery. Next is revising the illegitimate. So what should we change in disabled embodiment to restore humanness? So, you know, well, okay, let's say that disabled people should reach certain normative milestones, surgical intervention, plastic surgery, assistive technology, in order to achieve bona fide human status. Next is reinventing embodied humanness, which is something called the post-human, where prosthetics and new medical technology can either diminish or augment embodied humanness. And these new medical technologies are often used of disabled people in order to fit them in our ableist world. And next in the intersection is denying humanness, and this is used to eliminate bodies seen as unfit for life, unfit for our able-bodied society, and the legitimacy of being a human. And this is done through selective aborting and different medical interventions. So moving on, we're going to go to the next slide.
So I'll be discussing why is it important to include this knowledge in compulsory schooling. I've just written a few points on the slide about kind of increasing knowledge on equality and diversity to create more awareness. But I feel like that is kind of like the basic needs, but some people don't understand that. So I feel like that's one reason why it kind of needs to be done in schools. So it needs to be taught in schools and should be made compulsory. There's a sort of kind of level of ignorance that people have towards those who are disabled. This is because they do not understand the term disability, as this is something that was not covered in school. This allows a divide to happen, and this creates an us and them category when there really should be no difference between people who are disabled and people who are not. Each person views disability to the knowledge that they know of and are exposed to, which is why it's important to look at different aspects of disabilities from different lenses. The disability model allows society to understand why people who are disabled have been oppressed. Using the bottom-up approach means a society can remodel itself to consider disabled needs first, benefiting everyone to properly function in society. We're just going to move on to the next slide. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ferdos, and as previously mentioned by Sabina, the exploration of disability can help us to understand other forms of oppression that exist in society. For example, racial oppression. This is because when looking at disability as a way of understanding other forms of oppression, we can't not mention that for disability theorists, colonization has become a key metaphor to describe the experiences of oppression, marginalization, and exclusion to which disabled people are often subjugated to. Folkhouse terms biopolitics can be used to describe the colonial intervention in benefiting the white, able-bodied, masculine settler state, while producing epistemic, ontological, and practical negligence to subjugate disabled people. Biopolitics is the concept that denotes political power over life. As Folkhouse explains, it is to ensure, sustain, and multiply life, to put life in order. Esmail Khalil is a sociologist who explores the connections between race, colonialism, and disability in the context of the 19th century Imperial Britain. She argues that disability was not only another category of difference, but it also intersected with other forms of oppression to result in subjugating the other of the empire. As a result, disability contributes to structuring, framing, and situating the way in which all forms of difference were categorized and expressed. These categories of difference intersected as a direct result of slave owners using harsh punishments such as amputation of the limbs, mutilation, and other forms of torture on escaped slaves upon their return. The conflation of race and disability under colonial power served as a reminder of the notion that Africans suffered inner depravity that manifested on their bodies. This served as a biopolitical tool to configure disability as a direct effect of an inferior race. Going on to my next slide, disability and the colonial. The sociologist Stephanie Kennedy argues that disability played a critical role in valuing able-bodied slaves. This is as slave market prices were influenced by the health of their bonds. This resulted in a hierarchy of intersectional oppression based on them being valued as a commodity. This is something that is overlooked by post-colonial theorists in sociology, who also like to explore disability as a form of social administrative power that is used to maintain colonial control. It can be argued that this is to just uphold imperial knowledge of disabled bodies as being without any monetary or moral value. The lack of exploration in the use of this form of colonial administrative power led to colonies to continue using these tactics in the events, even if of settler state colonial resistance. An example of this would be the Kenya emergency in the 1950s, also known as the Mau Mau Uprising, was a war in the British Kenya colony. In this war, the British officials used excessive torture practices on many of the Kenyans that had detained in the Mau Mau investigation centres, many of whom had nothing to little to do with the insurgents. They also had thousands of Kenyan natives in camps with barbed wires, armed guards, where they carried out forced labour. These settings resembled the settings of a concentration camps. On the quote on the board, on the slide, it describes some of the experiences that one of the detainees faced at the hands of the British soldiers. Going back to why disability and disability rights should be included in compulsory schooling, the exploration of disability can help us understand how state power can disable those who are a threat. Historically, when uprisings occur in a war or slavery settings, feudal or state power diminish their ability to fight for their rights by taking away their physical or mental abilities to do so. We'll now be going on to the next slide, where we've listed some significant readings in the topic.
So throughout this presentation, we've discussed damaging views of disability and the history behind that through Ferdowsi's comments on colonization. What's most important to note is that the institutions and people who have decided these modes and views onto disability are the ones with the most privilege. And the reason they have done so and marked disabled bodies in this way is to maintain their own privilege and power. And Sapol and Rice in the 2010 book describe the body politic as a metaphor where society is conceived of as a biological body, where difference in the functions, the heart plays one role, the arms play another, and hierarchy of functions, the head governs and the rest obeys, represents this difference and hierarchy as natural. So this view on society can be extremely damaging, because in the same way as maybe sometimes someone's physical body may not function properly, their heart, their arm, whatever it may be, and therefore unable to function in an able-bodied society, by forming a hierarchy of function in, what is your duty in society, what is your role to play. When disabled people are unable to contribute to that body politic, they are excluded from it. They are not allowed to be in that group and of legitimization. So to continue, we're going to mention stigma.
Stigmatization is a social process where an attribute that is socially or culturally devalued and discredited is applied to one or a group of individuals, socially perceived superior group. These attributes can vary, they can be visible or hidden, and are divided by Goffman into three typologies. One of them is what individuals with physical disabilities face: abomination of the body. Stigma, defined as a discrediting attribute by Goffman, impacts the lives of individuals with disability. The stigma taken over their lives, becoming their identity. This should be included as it would be an insightful method of understanding and working towards inhibiting the stigmatization of disabled bodies within our society.
So where we've discussed 2 other readings, I think it's quite important to just leave one question. So before I ask the question, I would like everyone to kind of remember everything that we've spoken about. So from the concepts of disability through different lenses, how the state view disability, disabled identities, legitimacy theory, why it's compulsory to be in school in the first place, kind of what Ferdows discussed about colonial politics and the history of being disabled and in the colonial era, and kind of ask yourself, how do disabled bodies fit within a neo-colonized landscapes of power?
Here is our bibliography of where we got all of our resources. Please feel free to look them up. We hope this presentation has given you some insight into the damaging ways that we see disability and the reasons why we need to start seeing it in a new way. Thank you very much for listening to our presentation. Thank you.